Picture this. February 1959. The Ural Mountains in Russia. 9 experienced hikers cut their way out of their tent from the inside and ran into a blizzard wearing almost nothing. No shoes. Barely any clothes. In -30-degree cold. They were found weeks later. Scattered across the mountainside. Some half-naked. One is missing her tongue. Another with a fractured skull. For 60 years, investigators, scientists, and conspiracy theorists couldn't figure out what the hell happened that night. But now, we finally know. January 23, 1959. 10 friends set out on a skiing expedition across the northern Urals. These weren't amateurs, they were grade 2 hikers, the second highest certification in the Soviet Union. Think of them as the Navy SEALs of winter camping. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov. 23 years old, engineering student, experienced mountaineer. He'd planned the route for months. The goal? Reach a mountain called Otorten, about 200 miles away, through brutal winter terrain. It was classified as a Category 3 expedition, the most difficult. The kind of trip that would earn them all their Grade 3 certification. One person turned back early because of health issues. That left 9. 5 men, 4 women. All in their 20s except one, a 37-year-old instructor who'd asked to come along at the last minute. They were supposed to send a telegram when they returned on February 12. The telegram never came. When the group didn't show up, people assumed they'd just been delayed by the weather. This was Siberia in winter. Delays happened. But by February 20th, families were panicking. A search party finally set out on February 26th. What they found on that mountainside still gives people nightmares. First, the tent. Pitched on a slope they'd later call Dyatlov Pass. The tent had been cut open from the inside. Long slashes, deliberate cuts. Like someone was desperately trying to get out. But here's the thing, the tent was still standing. Partially collapsed from snow, but intact. All their supplies were inside. Food. Warm clothes. Boots. Their shoes were still lined up neatly at the entrance. Whatever made them leave, they didn't take anything with them. The searchers followed footprints down the slope. 8 or 9 sets of prints, some barefoot, some in socks, heading toward the tree line about a mile away. And then they started finding bodies. The first 2 were found under a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. Both were wearing almost nothing, just underwear. Frozen solid. Someone had tried to climb the cedar tree. Branches were broken up to 15 feet high, like they'd been trying to see something back toward the tent. There was a small fire, barely used. Not nearly enough to survive in that cold. 3 more bodies were found between the cedar tree and the tent. Igor Dyatlov himself, Zina Ida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. They were spread out, like they'd been trying to crawl back to camp. All frozen. All in various states of undress. It took 2 more months to find the last 4. They were buried under 13 feet of snow in a ravine about 200 feet from the cedar tree. And this is where things get disturbing. Ludmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, and part of her lips. Semyon Zolotaryov was missing his eyes. Alexander Kolevatov had his eyebrows removed. But here's what really freaked investigators out, 3 of them had massive internal injuries. Broken ribs. Fractured skulls. The kind of trauma you'd see in a car crash. The medical examiner said the force required would be similar to a car hitting them at high speed. Yet their bodies had no external wounds. No cuts. No bruises on the skin. The Soviet investigation concluded death by an unknown compelling force. Really helpful, right? That vague conclusion sparked 60 years of theories. Avalanche? Nope. The slope wasn't steep enough, and there was no evidence of an avalanche. Plus, if they'd been buried, why would they run a mile away? Military testing? Some people thought the Soviet military had been testing weapons nearby. But there were no burn marks, no radiation beyond normal levels, and the military denied having operations in that area. Infrasound? There's this phenomenon where wind over mountains creates low-frequency sound waves that cause panic in humans. Makes your chest vibrate, triggers irrational fear. But that doesn't explain the massive internal injuries. Yeti? Aliens? Government conspiracy? Yeah, people went there. Especially after stories came out that some of the victims' clothes had traces of radiation. But those traces were tiny, likely from contamination during testing, and definitely not enough to hurt anyone. For decades, the case was frozen literally and figuratively. No explanation fit all the facts. And then in 2019, Russian authorities reopened the investigation. A team of scientists from Switzerland and Russia started from scratch. They used modern avalanche simulations, trauma analysis, and something called snow mechanics modeling. Here's what they figured out. First, the tent. It was pitched on a slope at about 11 at night. They dug into the snow to create a flat platform. This is a normal camping technique, you carve out a little shelf on the slope. But here's what they didn't know. By cutting into the snow like that, they created an unstable layer. And the wind that night was picking up. Records show gusts of around 60 miles per hour. The wind also created something called katabatic wind, cold, dense air that flows down a mountain slope. When this kind of wind hits just right, it can create infrasound. Those low-frequency waves I mentioned earlier. Around midnight, the hikers started feeling it. Pressure in their chests. Irrational panic. Ever had that feeling where you just know something's wrong but you can't explain why? Imagine that cranked up to 11. They became convinced something terrible was about to happen. Maybe they thought they heard an avalanche coming. Maybe they just felt overwhelming dread. So they cut their way out of the tent and ran. Not because something was chasing them, but because their brains were telling them to flee immediately. When you're in that state of panic, you don't stop to put on boots. They made it to the tree line. Built a small fire. Started trying to calm down. But they were already hypothermic. And confused. Now here's the second part of the puzzle, those massive internal injuries. About 2 to 3 hours after the hikers fled their tent, a slab avalanche hit. Not a huge one, maybe 10 feet wide, 3 feet deep. But enough. 4 of the hikers were in the wrong place. Standing in a ravine where snow had accumulated. The avalanche wasn't like what you see in movies, a giant wave of snow. This was a dense, heavy slab that compressed like concrete. It hit those 4 hikers with tremendous force. The 2019 study actually calculated the impact. Using the same models aerospace engineers use for car crashes, they determined that a relatively small snow slab could absolutely cause the injuries documented in the autopsy reports. Broken ribs. Fractured skulls. Massive internal damage. But no external wounds because the snow distributed the force evenly across their bodies. As for the missing soft tissue, eyes, tongue, lips, that's actually common in bodies exposed to the elements. Scavengers, decomposition, and the fact that these parts are the first to deteriorate. It sounds sinister, but it's just nature. The hikers who weren't caught in the avalanche tried to make it back to the tent. That's why 3 bodies were found spread out on the slope they were trying to return. But they were too cold, too exhausted. One by one, they collapsed. So there you have it. No conspiracy. No secret weapons. No Yeti. Just a perfect storm of bad luck. A campsite in the wrong spot. Wind is creating infrasound at just the wrong time. A panic that made experienced hikers do something irrational. And a small avalanche that happened hours later in the dark. The 2019 study was published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. The Russian government officially closed the case in 2020, citing an avalanche and subsequent hypothermia. Some people still don't buy it. They point to inconsistencies, unanswered questions, the weirdness of it all. And look, I get it. When something is this strange, it's tempting to believe there's more to the story. But sometimes the truth is just tragic. 9 skilled hikers made a series of small mistakes that compounded into a disaster. They were unlucky. And that's scarier than any conspiracy because it means that even when you do everything right, nature can still kill you. The Dyatlov Pass incident haunted people for 60 years because we needed it to mean something. We needed there to be a villain, a reason, something we could point to and say, that's why it happened. But the real answer is simpler and sadder. They were just in the wrong place when the mountain decided to remind them who was in charge. If you want to see more mysteries like this solved, let me know in the comments what I should cover next. And if you made it this far, thanks for watching. The mountains are still there, by the way. People still ski through Dyatlov Pass. They just don't camp on that particular slope anymore.